just remember stories are embellished quite a bit, so just be aware of that. So I thought we would continue looking at denominational doctrines, and this morning I thought we'd take a look at the idea, or what is recognized as the social gospel. The social gospel influence is evident in almost all denominational churches today. It arose around 1870-ish. The influence of major university divinity schools. In other words, these schools that were established under the cuspis of Christianity, if you will, under these denominational churches, they started seeing social issues and thought that the church was a good way of handling those things. It shifted the emphasis from personal sin and salvation, if you will, to social sins and salvations. Again, from the person to society as a whole, if you will. It viewed the coming of the kingdom of God as when the gospel produced a utopian type society, quoting, or looking to Matthew 6:10. It believed that the church and the clergy of the church role was facilitating their view of the kingdom here on earth, if you will. It emphasized improving man's life here rather than preparing life for the thereafter. It influenced churches to minister to the whole man, if you will, rather than man's spiritual needs. So, again, the emphasis being put on the physical, not necessarily the spiritual. And it caused many fundamentalists to unwitting the gospel of Christ, if you will. So let's begin by looking at the social gospel influences upon churches today. There was a rapid growth of multi-purpose facilities, if you will, in the late 1990s, in the late 1900s. Gymnasiums, great, I don't know what monolithic structures, if you will. Gymnasiums, cafeterias, however you want to slice and dice it. In other words, in order to facilitate these physical needs of people, they felt that they had to construct the necessary infrastructure to emphasize those things. Again, and if we look to the pattern of the New Testament, we don't see any examples of that within the New Testament. The greater involvement of churches in political and social issues. We see that yet today, especially during election years. We see in the TV, we see clergymen come on TV and give their political views, or we'll hear about how certain sermons are being preached towards certain political candidates and stuff. Again, people, focusing on the temporal versus spiritual aspects, or being concerned more about the temporal things in life than that of the spiritual. Social issues. If we look to the 1960s, we saw a great rise of many activist churches get involved into the civil rights issues, if you will. Matter of fact, many of I can't remember their names, but if you go back to the 1870s, many that got involved in many of the political issues of the days back then, which was mainly like around child labor, things like with the birth of the industrial age. That's who Martin Luther King kind of fashioned himself after in the civil rights movement. Now, were those all good works? Were those things that need to be led and stuff? Absolutely. But it wasn't something that the church should have led. I would argue no. Church should be focused more on not the physical things of life, but that of the spiritual things. And then it also led to the increase in the number of ministries and the ministers listed by churches. These ministries, like I say, the turn of the 20th century, it was unionizing workforces, fair wages, stuff like that. Then we go to the mid 19th century, civil rights issues, stuff like that. Then we go beyond that, and here today, we it's look at the split within the Methodist Church with the LGBT movement and stuff. Again, no emphasis, or I don't hear. Granted, I don't attend these churches, but I hear very little emphasis in the media and on the internet about the spiritual aspect stuff. But you hear all this emphasis on these political movements, if you will, from these entities. So to me, it leads to a misplacement of focus on what God would have us to do. So, the effects on churches today, if you will, is the introduction of cultural and entertainment events into the church calendars. Again, these cultural events, forming activist groups, if you will, bringing people together to spread those activists or those concerns, if you will, from a societal aspect. And then entertainment. A lot of times they will package certain entertainment activities in order to spread that man-made news that they want to spread. So I looked up one web article on church ministries, and this guy gave a list of 30 different ministries that a church could get involved in order to help spread the word, if you will. And they consisted of, movie night, breakfast social get-together, and you just name it. Was all centered around man-made type entertainment. No focus on, any type of gospel meeting, no emphasis on preaching the gospel, no type, nothing like that. It was all, gimmicky and appealing from an entertainment type aspect. The involvement of the clergy in social and political activism leads to demonstrations, and we see that today. People making spectacles of themselves, people wearing, whatever clergy outfit that they think that their clergy ought to wear, and them going and marching and being involved and getting on TV and speaking about these different social issues that society is facing. Again, not coming on TV to explaining to people that they need to be saved or how to find God in their life or the pattern of salvation. No, it's a focus on whatever the societal activism is of that day. And we can look at the Salvation Army is a great example of the social get carried to its logical conclusion. I don't know how many people I've talked to that, they talk about, oh yeah, I go over to the Salvation Army for this, go over to Salvation for that. I said, that they're a religious organization, right? And that they preach a doctrine, right? No, I didn't know that they was linked to anything like that. No, most people don't even realize that they are a like church type organization. And so you can just see the effects on the church. Like I say, most people consider them more like the Red Cross than that of a church, if you will. So, here, to me, if you ask me, they've almost completely lost their identity, if you will. So what's the difference between the social gospel and the gospel of Christ? That's what we'll look at now. Well, the emphasis of the gospel of Christ is personal, and the social gospel is a focus on the societal aspects of life, if you will. But again, and when we scour our Bible, when we study our Bible, we don't even Christ himself didn't get involved in societal issues or political issues of his day. It was all about doing the work of his Father. You know, bringing the good news, if you will. You know, this is how salvation comes. But instead, when it comes to the social gospel, when we study that, or if you look it up, Google it, look at the things that they were involved. Like I say, child labor, unionizing, civil rights, etc., etc., entertainment, social, social get-togethers. The list goes on. Concerts, facilitating concerts. And they say, oh, this is good work, and they'll spend 2 hours entertaining their people, and then they spend 15 minutes or maybe 5 minutes offering up prayer. Hey, if anybody would like to learn about Christ, come over here. We'll sit off to the side. I would argue it's a bait and switch tactic, but then two, we don't see any pattern that within the new church or the New Testament church, if you will. John dealt with John the Baptist, that is, he dealt with Herod's sins and not the ills of his government. That's what we see there in Matthew 14. There's nothing recorded where he went and complained, you're not taking care of people of society, or you're not treating people. No, he said, you don't have a right to marry your brother's daughter, your brother's wife. Jesus came to seek and save the lost, not to settle all the problems of the society. While the Jews of the day may have wanted him to, take on the Roman government and be that king that they wanted, that was not his mission. He was there to save souls. Luke 19:10 tells us that the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. Luke 12:14 says, but he said to them, man, who made me a judge or arbiter over you? So, again, if Christ, Paul says, be a pattern unto me as I am a pattern unto Christ. Where do we see the pattern for facilitating these type things within the church? I don't see it. It's not in my Bible. Maybe somebody's printed it into their Bible, but as far as I know, there's no justification for getting involved in societal issues, if you will, from a church aspect. The gospel assumes that sins is individually based, and the social gospel that it is the society based. And I mean, that plays right into psychology today. The problem is not with the individual. The problem is with the environment that the individual exists in. So it's never the individual's fault. It's everybody's fault around them that causes these things. And again, that's the farthest thing. Even from our Bible study this morning, rich young ruler could have said, "Well, that's the way my parents raised me," but that's not what Christ said. Christ didn't say, "Well, if your parents would have raised you right, you wouldn't have that problem." No. He says you got it. If you want to be perfect, the emphasis in the gospel has always been on the individual, if you will. Because it's the individual, and you can change society one individual at a time. But the emphasis is that we need to save souls. We need to create Christians, and then by living the Christian life, then we live rightly. Then we learn how to treat all men with respect, with all men with dignity. That there is no difference between one man versus the other. Another thing is the problem versus the symptom, if you will. The gospel treats the problem, personal sin, and the social gospel treats the symptom or society problems. Again, instead of again, just like we said on the last slide, instead of teaching people to deal with their vices and help them guide them spiritually and stuff. The social gospel puts the whims all on society, and that we're a product of our environment. And then they teach that until we change society, we can't fix the individual. But again, that's complete opposite of what the gospel taught and how the gospel dealt with things over and over and over again. Even all the problems there in Corinth, Paul was talking to what he was talking about. Each individual needed to be corrected. I could go on and on. And then thus that will fix society as a whole. Unfortunately, in our society today, we see a far departure. You go back 10 years ago, there became less people that were attached to churches or members of the churches than those who were for the first time in the history of our nation. And we see a continual spiral, if you will, in the debasement of our society. We wonder, and people wonder, why are we having these issues? Well, because there's no accountability. People aren't motivated. People aren't led by their God. They're led by their own wishes, wants, and desires. That's it, and that's a big problem. Personal sin is minimized in the social gospel, and social ills or the sins of society are magnified. Personal sins are seen as socially based rather than the opposite. And again, a society is comprised of individuals, so therefore the problems of society are based upon what the actions of those individuals within that society are. So how do you fix that? You focus in on those individuals, just as the pattern that was established in the New Testament. Just as the way that Christ dealt with things, just the way the apostles dealt with things. Just as the way the preachers of the day in the New Testament dealt with things. So the gospel of Christ and the social gospel have two different views of the church. Institutions ministering to spiritual needs rather than social and temporal needs. Again, the mission of the church in the New Testament is, again, to facilitate and minister to our spiritual needs. But that's the farthest thing from what the social gospel brings. Consider 1 Timothy 3:15, where it says, "But if I'm delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar of the ground and the ground of truth." Again, that you ought to know how to conduct yourself. So the Bible teaches personal conduct, if you will. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 16 says, "And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ." That's the mission of the church right there. Till we come to the unity of faith and to the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. That we should no longer be children, tossed to and fro and carried about with every wind of doctrine, or by trickery of men, and the cunning craftiness or deceitful plotting, but speaking the truth in love, may grow up in all things into him who is the head, Christ, for whom the whole body, joined and knit together by what every joint supplies, according to the effective working by which every part does its share, causes growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. Right there. If there was a mission statement for the church, right there it is. Till we come to the unity of faith and to the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man. How do we become whole and complete? by carrying out, executing that mission statement right there. Not by trying to fix societal problems, not by getting involved in false ministries. Again, he even speaks to that, saying not being not carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men. That's what the social gospel is. They even speaking of this, the coming social gospel, if you will. It provides opportunities to worship God and to study His Word. That's what the church is to do. And it provides a means to preach the gospel to the lost and to the saved. That's all that the church needs to do. If we just focus on that, then and convert people, things will take care of itself. We don't have to get involved in all these other ministries, if you will. Institutions with very limited roles in benevolence rather than general welfare society. Again, when it comes to taking care of people, if we look at the pattern that was established, like when there's a famine with the Church of Jerusalem, they collected. They brought together men. They collected from those different churches, but they did what? They took it back to the elders of those churches that ministered unto those saints. It says they didn't minister to all of Jerusalem. They didn't go in there and try to correct Jerusalem. They took care of those Christians that were at Jerusalem. Those Christians that were in those churches at Jerusalem. Those individuals who were Christians within those churches there at Jerusalem. That's what the church did. But today the social gospel would tell you, we need to take care of all men. We need to be good to all men. We do as individuals, yeah, but not the church. That's not the work of the church. That's what I call that load shedding. I as an individual, I have a great responsibility to my fellow Christians as well as to all of mankind. But my responsibilities aren't the responsibilities of the church. But yet that's what people want to do. That's what the social gospel does. The gospel takes that burden off the individual and says, we as a collective, we can do these things. Again, look to Ephesians 4:11 through 16. Nowhere in there when he's talking about, what the church does and what we need to be to focus on, does he talk about that the church needs to get involved with the societal problems. It's not in there. And then we have differing views of the work of the church. That's kind of what we've been talking about all along. The gospel of Christ forbids the church involvement in social activities, if you will. Now, granted, look to the Spirit, if you will, 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And there in verse 22, remember they were perverting the Lord's Supper. They were making a common meal out of it, if you will. It says what? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in, or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say then? Shall I praise you in this? I do not. And then in verse 34, kind of towards his final rebuke there, he says, but if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home. In other words, we come to here for the spiritual things. If you have physical things, do them at your home. Lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. I like that. There's other issues, in other words, and I'll correct those when I get there. But I'm just taking care of the big ones. Now, that's not a prohibition, like, no, can't have any food in the building. That's not what's being discussed here. What's being discussed is they lost their focus. They were focused on temporal things. They were focused on filling their bellies. They weren't focused on each other, and they weren't focused on the spiritual aspect of the Lord's Supper. Same thing, when we get involved in society activities, we lose the focus on the spiritual and we start focusing on the temporal. Same spirit in which this rebuke was given. That's the problem with the social. I'm not saying that there's social problems. There's not problems in society and that they don't need to be fixed. I'm just saying it's not the responsibility of the church as a whole to fix them. If patrons of the church want to get involved in those things, yeah, form a group, form a nonprofit organization or whatnot. But don't do it as the church. Don't say this is the work of the church. That's not what the work of the church is. The gospel of Christ ministers to the spirit of man, and the social gospel attempts to minister to the whole man. Well, we mean, they try to say, well, we're the spirit as well as the physical. Again, Paul would say we are to be content with food, raiment, and clothing. What more do we need? But the social gospel says, we got ills here. We need to fix these. And we murmur and complain to our politicians and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, just completely different views of the work of the church. Again, we look to the pattern of the New Testament as far as for the authority. We should have book, chapter, verse for everything that we do, right? If we don't have book, chapter, verse, then what? Then we're making up our own doctrine. We're making up our own work. So in conclusion, that's the social gospel, and that's just touching on the surface. Again, these aren't deep dives into these, but just to kind of just give a contrast, if there's a little bit wrong with it, that means that there's a lot wrong with it, right? A little bit of sin is just as bad as a lot of sin, but God doesn't put degrees on sin. So, if that's our justification, well, I hear it's not in but it's a good work. It's a good work, Again, either it's authorized or it's not authorized. Period. Dot. If it's authorized, then we should be doing it. Needs of man, because its mission is spiritual in nature. Period. Dot. And so we need to stick to facilitating that spiritual mission, if you will. We need to focus on the spirituality of man, not the physical aspect of man. Because when we start focusing on the physical, then we start losing our focus on the spiritual. And so now we want to extend the invitation. That's the social gospel, if you will. If you want to talk any further or explore any other aspects of that, by all means, get with me. Be glad to do so. But for right now, we want to extend the invitation. The invitation is your opportunity to get spiritually right with the Lord. Maybe there's some things going on. Maybe there's some temporal things going on in your life that's causing you to make bad decisions, if you will. That's affecting your spirituality. Well, that's what the invitation's all about. We see a pattern established in the New Testament church where people did things and then they would call upon others to pray on their behalf. So we'd be glad to pray on your behalf. Or perhaps you're not even a Christian at all. Why not respond to that gospel call? Again, that's what we're here for. We're here to create new Christians and so that you may start life anew. What more glorious thing, what greater gift could you give to yourself than to purge yourself of all sins and to start life anew? So if you're subject to the gospel call in any shape, form, or manner, let it be known as we stand and sing the songs of the chosen.